girls. This is my test review podcast for your first test, which will be on chapters 1, 2, and 3 in the Gardner textbook. So I'm just going to quickly tie up some loose ends and make sure you're prepared for the short answer and essay question. So just to kind of review with you, the format of the test will be 30 multiple choice questions, which will be 2 points each. You will then have 4 short answer questions, which will be 20 points in total, and then a long essay at the end, which is also worth 20 points. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly through a few of the prehistoric artworks that you may need to know about. I'm looking at your test now, and it looks like there's only a handful of questions on prehistoric art. It looks like 4 or 5. So I'm just going to tell you right now to make sure you read up on Stonehenge, review the Hall of the Bulls from the Lascaux Caves, and Jade Kong, which I'll talk about that a little bit in just a moment. And I think that's it. Okay, so let me just skip to Jade Kong because I know I didn't talk about that in class, so let me just do that now. Okay, so both of these images were actually on your worksheet that you had to do for homework, but I know a few of you had some trouble finding some information about them. I actually found a really good Khan Academy video about Jade Kong. So if you have time, just go to YouTube and type in Jade Kong Khan Academy and you can find the video. It's only 5 minutes long, but it gives you a nice little view of it because we talked about how it's good to see these artworks in the round instead of just one two-dimensional image. Anyway, Jade Kong was found, and it's prehistoric. You can see the date here is 2500 BCE. We spoke a little bit about kind of the beginning of art history and when scholars believe art was first created. So do you remember about what year that was? Okay, hopefully you're thinking around the 30,000 BC area. That was in the introduction to chapter 1. So that's when it's believed that man first intentionally started creating art. And this is actually not too far away from that time. However, this is different from the other pieces of prehistoric art that we looked at. It looks very different. The material is different. And a lot of the work that we looked at from prehistory was from the western part of the world, a lot of pieces in Europe. So this is actually from China. I think this is the only piece that is from Asia, so that's pretty cool in itself. So the function of this piece is pretty much unknown. Scholars believe that this may have been buried with someone. This may have been found in a tomb. And the other amazing thing about it is it's very hard material. If you've ever seen a piece of jade jewelry or jade sculpture, then you know that jade is kind of this very light green, very pretty stone. And it's extremely hard. So it was really hard to carve into. I think in the video they talked about how they believe people would have had to use sand and rub the sand on the surface of the object to create indentations. So it was extremely hard to carve, very durable material, and we believe that this piece, the Jade Kong, was actually an abstract view of a face. You know, some of these would have human-like faces, others would be faces of monsters or some kind of creature, but they do believe that these abstract patterns represented a face. Moving on to chapter 2, the art of the ancient Near East. Okay, our time period is 3500 BCE to about 636 BCE. We saw a lot of themes in the art of the ancient Near East, but most common theme was power and authority and violence. And why was that the case? Okay, we discussed this in class, so hopefully you remember. This guy on the first slide, it's actually in the first and second slide, you should definitely know about. So what were these called? What were these colossal statues called? Where were they originally placed and why? So think about that. Okay, and what specific city-state were they associated with? Then we move to our map. Here's a little map of what the ancient Near East looked like in about 3500 BCE. So think about the geographic aspects of this civilization. Where were these civilizations located? In between the Tigris and Euphrates River, which is a really, really important part of their civilization. And how were these different peoples, how were they organized within that area? Okay, so hopefully you're remembering that it was divided into city-states. Okay, and the city-states were, often invading one another, and so there was always kind of this worry that, there was not very much stability, is what I'm trying to say, which is in contrast to ancient Egypt, which we saw for the most part was pretty stable. There was not a lot of war going on in that part of the world. And then we looked at the White Temple and ziggurat. This was part of the Sumerian civilization. And I would say be very, very familiar with a ziggurat. So, and this is obviously very much in the remains of the White Temple and ziggurat, but they give you a really nice reconstructed drawing of what a ziggurat looks like. So just really know the function of a ziggurat. We looked at a mastaba, which it looks very similar, but the function was quite different. So, make sure you think about that. Know what each one looks like, and then think about the differences between the functions of both a ziggurat and a mastaba. We also talked about the Royal Cemetery at Ur and how that was discovered by Leonard Woolley, and how important that discovery was, and how much that told us about the ancient civilizations of the Near East. We also looked at several objects that were found there, musical instruments, containers, things like that. So we did learn that people were buried with some of their belongings. We also know that these civilizations of the Near East were a polytheistic society, so they built temples to honor deities. So one of the items that we looked at very closely that you had to research for homework was the Standard of Ur. And if you need to refresh your memory on this, just read about it in your book or watch the little video that I've embedded into the PowerPoint, and that will kind of give you a refresher. But think about, again, the function of this item. What was it used for, or what was it believed to be used for? The form, so what was it made of? What was this pretty blue stone in the background, and where did that come from? And then think about all the different vocabulary terms we learned. I know there's a lot of them and it can be overwhelming, but just kind of try to keep them straight. So we see hierarchy of scale here. Okay, and this is the war side of the Standard of Ur. So remember, we talked about the war side, and then we compared it to the peace side on the other side of the box. So we talked about hierarchy of scale, which is when one person is larger than the rest of the people in the composition to show importance or power and authority. And then we also talked about composite view or twisted perspective, when part of the body is in profile and then other parts of the body are viewed from the front. So it's kind of a wacky perspective, but that's because, art of this time was not as developed as it is now, obviously. We also looked at this briefly, but I want you to make sure that you read about it again. This is the cylinder seal. And hopefully you remember from my little explanation in class that this piece here was the actual cylinder seal. It's a cylindrical piece of stone, probably some hard material. It looks like this one was made of lapis lazuli, to which a person would then carve pictures and cuneiform, remember that system of writing that the Sumerians developed, would carve something that would make it possible for them to label things that they own. Okay, so you can see a definition down here. The cylinder seal consists of a cylindrical piece of stone engraved to produce a raised impression when rolled over clay. The function of this cylinder seal is to identify ownership of something and also to warn people not to open it, sort of a protection type thing. Okay, so make sure you're familiar with this too. We went to ancient Egypt, and I only have 5 minutes left, so I really need to cover this pretty quickly. What I will tell you though is that there are a lot of questions on ancient Egypt, so I would definitely spend the majority of your time reviewing ancient Egypt. And think about, as you go through and as you study, think about the differences between the ancient Near East and ancient Egypt. Think about social differences between the two. Think about geographic differences between the two, religious differences, and be able to discuss two works of art that illustrate those differences. All right, and we talked about a couple in class. You had to analyze a couple of works for homework. So I would hope that you are comfortable speaking, or I'm sorry, writing about one work of art from the ancient Near East and one work of art from ancient Egypt. All right, so just, an example, we talked about these two in depth in class. You had to do a little activity with these two images, and also the Victory Stele of Naram Sin and the Palette of Narmer would be another good comparison. So you can certainly use these images if you want to, or you can pick two other images that you're comfortable talking about. To any specific works of art, I want to just take you to these little review slides I have at the end of the PowerPoint. So really just make sure that you're aware that the pyramids are associated with the Old Kingdom. Remember how we kind of divided the Egyptian civilization into 3 different kingdoms, or 3 different time periods. So you began with the mastaba, which is sort of a flattened pyramid. You then moved, and that's, pre-dynastic. Once you move into the Old Kingdom, you see pyramids as a tomb for burial. Middle Kingdom contained rock-cut tombs, and then New Kingdom was known for its temples. Okay? And then this little slide at the end of the PowerPoint is also very, very helpful. So really review these items. I would say make an outline tonight and decide which 2 works of art you're going to be discussing in your essay. And make sure that you're addressing, as I said, social, geographic, religious, political differences between the 2 civilizations. And I am going to talk about this in just a minute, but before I do, I want to remind you to make sure you play the Jeopardy, which is available on Canvas under modules. I think it says chapter 2 and 3. Really make sure that you play the Jeopardy, because that has a lot of hints to many of the multiple choice questions in there. So be sure to check that out. This hypostyle hall was part of the Temple of Amun-Re in Karnak. We looked at it briefly in class, and I want you to kind of review these architectural terms that I went over in class. Again, I know there were a lot of them, but unfortunately, you really do need to know them. A hypostyle hall, as we discussed, was just a hall with many, many columns. And then another term that I want you to remember, this was on your quiz, was that portion at the top of the hypostyle hall. See this graded area that allowed light to filter in? That's called the clerestory. So girls, I'm going to have to wrap this up because I don't have very much time left, but one other thing that I want you to read about and make sure you're comfortable discussing is the Amarna period. So who was responsible for the Amarna period? What characteristics do we see in Amarna period sculpture and art, and how does that compare to, say, sculptures from the Old Kingdom? So be comfortable talking about that as well. And I'm going to end my podcast here, so I'll send you all a little reminder email, but just remember to review the reading, play the Jeopardy, obviously listen to my podcasts, and have an outline ready to go, and I will see you in the morning. Good luck.